I have to record it just because I haven't done a quiz on this specifically for a while because of the fact that just the way the semester fell, I didn't get through as much as I wanted to. Quiz is next class, so it's going to be on Friday in here. Which is the 26th. So making sure you guys have a calculator with you guys, that you're comfortable with everything we're talking about. If you're not, please make sure you guys are stopping in to see me during AR. Obviously during AR Wednesdays, we typically don't have that time. So Thursday or Friday coming in, using that scrimmage to kind of help you guys to know what you guys need to be aware of and what you're doing well on and what you're not. So kind of using that as well. So in section 6.5 is where we first talked about absolute value, solving absolute value equations. And you guys recall, this is where we came up with the fact that we can have up to 2 solutions. So depending on the problem we had, we could have 2 solutions for this. So some of you guys on your scrimmage, on the front side of the scrimmage, I said, what's your other answer? So you missed half the answer, or half the question. We forgot half of it. So we want to make sure we include both solutions. But we want to remember that first we need to isolate that absolute value first. Once I isolate the absolute value, that's where we're going to set up the 2 types of equations. So set up 2 equations if needed. And I say if applicable, because sometimes you won't need to. Make sure you're writing this down, please. So we could have up to 2 answers, we could have no answers, or we could have just 1 answer. Most of the time we're going to have the 2. So this first one, the absolute value is already isolated for us. We have 3x plus 5 equals 18. So we're ready to set up our 2 versions. And this is where I covered it up with the heart. And I said, what could be underneath here? And so if I said, what could be underneath, like what's inside the absolute value, you would see either 18 or negative 18. So that's where we set up our 2 equations. We have our 2 equations here. Please be doing this with us. And a reminder that it's really, like if you have a little bit of extra time, especially since this is just a quiz, it will not take a really long time for us to take this. And so take an extra minute to check your answers when you get done. They should both work. So I'm going to move this 5 over. And then I divide by 3. And so I find out that x is, what is that? 4.3 repeating. Now that might be a little bit tougher one to check, but you could take that number and multiply it by 3 and add 5 and see if it's 18. And then we're going to do the same thing over here. So we have negative 23 over here. And that's going to be like 7.6 repeating, I believe. So like 6, 7. two solutions. Now, we'll talk a little bit about when we have no solution and when we have only one solution. But this next one, before we go too fast with doing this, this is where I have to start by isolating this absolute value first. So before I set up my two equations, what do I have to do? We have to subtract 4. So we have the absolute value x minus 2 equals 6. Now at this point, now we're ready to set up our two equations. This is this point where you want to do that. You don't want to do that initially, otherwise one of your answers is going to be wrong. So x minus 2 equals 6, and x minus 2 equals a negative 6. There are two possibilities there. So we end up with x is 8. And here we get x is negative 4. So those are our two possibilities. And we want to include both of them. Now I do want to, really quick before we get on to the next type of problem, I do want to mention those two special cases. These don't come up very often, but just to make sure it's clear in case they do arise, is if I have like x plus 5 equals 0, there's only one way to get 0. So this would only have one solution. It would just be negative 5. Because that's the only way to get 0. So that's a special case. The other special case is if I had x minus 3 equals negative 8. There's no way to get our absolute value to equal a negative 8. So this one is no solution. Again, these don't come up very often, but I want to make sure you guys know if you see them that you don't make that mistake. Any questions there? All right, our next type of problem is in 6.6 is when we talked about combining inequalities with our absolute value. So So this is where we have the open versus closed circle. We also have like the and or. We also want to remember to isolate the absolute values first. And this one, when we set up the two equations, we set up the two inequalities, we want to make sure we flip the inequality on the negative one. So you're going to set up your two inequalities and you're going to flip the inequalities on the negative one. So we'll do a few examples of these. We'll do a couple and take a break here. So for this first problem, the absolute value is already isolated, and you probably have to write a little bit smaller on these. I tried to squeeze them on without making them too tiny, but kind of hard to fit all those on there. So we're going to set up our two inequalities. Oh, that should be a 3. So I made myself a note that I flipped the inequality on that negative one. And again, you probably want to write a little bit smaller here. And I have to solve each of these. Then I'll put them on the number line. And once I have them on the number line, I determine if it's an and or an or inequality. So I have 14 there. So there's half my answer. There's my other answer. I go to put these on my number line. It doesn't matter, you don't have to like count spaces. But this time it's going to be that filled in circle. And then we have to decide if it's an and or an or. It's greater than 7, but less than negative 10. So we say this is an or inequality. On the test, I will ask you if it's an and or an or, and it's pretty easy to tell if you graphed it correctly. And I'll probably, hopefully, base your answer based off of what your graph looks like. Remember, the arrows should never both be going the same direction. Something went wrong with your solving. You probably forgot to flip it if the arrows are both going the same direction. So careful about that. We'll do this one, then we'll take a break here. So this one, we're going to set up our two equations. Again, the absolute value is already isolated. What's our first step on solving this, you guys? Yeah, we're going to multiply each side by 2 to get rid of that divide by 2. Yikes, my board is going all over the place. It's like...
This is developing read only or
multiply by 2. So this will cancel. And then I'll move this over. So there's one of my answers. I'm going to do the same thing on this one. There's our other answer. And we're going to go to put that on our number line. And again, I don't care about the spacing. Open circles this time. Yep.
That means we're gonna go towards each other.
It's less than 19, but greater than negative 13. So this is an and inequality. Okay. So what we're going to do is we're going to do some practice problems with solving absolute value inequality and equations. So it's not a super long Kahoot, we're going to do a Kahoot. If you want some scratch paper, you guys can grab whiteboards, markers, erasers. If you don't need, like if you don't think you need scratch paper, I'm going to warn you guys, it's a little tough to decipher the two answers. So I would recommend it. What?
We can use our notebook.